Hello, my name is John Rose, and in this video I'd like to take a closer look at why we don't have an essential need for carbohydrates. Now I've talked about this before in one of my other videos on low carbohydrate nonsense, and you can go down below in the description box and check out that video if you want to. And what I explained in that video is the same thing I just explained in this prior video about how there's only one group of food that wants us to eat it. There's a symbiotic relationship with that food. And when we look at what that food is made up of, it's made up of mainly carbohydrates. So why don't we have an essential need for carbohydrates? Well, part of the problem is our so-called experts haven't figured out a way to calculate that. And then there are several ways you could then use how you could calculate it to determine what our essential needs are. And I looked at it two ways. You see, I got into this 28 years ago because I perfected a very complicated mathematical procedure to keep track of my carbohydrate fuel tank. Every minute went by, I kept track of it going up and down based on what I was doing and what I was eating. And I realized how this fuel tank goes up and down, and I really understand what our needs are. We do have needs for carbohydrates. We don't want that fuel tank to empty. So that would be one way we could look at our essential needs. But then we have a backup system for that. So this is what's many times used as saying, we don't have an essential need for carbohydrates because we've got a backup system. Well, but that backup system doesn't have a backup. So we do have an essential need. We don't want to rely on the backup system, and that's what a lot of people do when they kick in ketosis. These low carbohydrate diets are designed to use our emergency system. We have an essential need for carbohydrates, and there's two ways to look at it. One is what happens when the small fuel tank empties. Then we can say, oh, we need it now to avoid gluconeogenesis. Or we can say, our goal, which should be, in fact, if you understand everything, you should realize that our goal every time we eat is to top off that small carbohydrate fuel tank. Because when we eat the food that wants us to eat, it's about 90% carbohydrates. So every time we eat, we should be filling up our fuel tank more than it needs, and the excess goes to fat. That's how we're designed. So that's, to me, what our essential needs are. Every time that fuel tank starts going down, if it goes down by 200, that's our needs to get it back up to where it's supposed to be. Why? Because every time we eat the only food that wants us to eat it, we're topping off our carbohydrate fuel tank. Every time the fuel tank goes down, now we need to fill it back to the top again. The tricky part here, and the reason why they don't say we have an essential needs, is you can go down and go down and go down and go down and go down, and you don't run into a problem until you run empty. And when it runs empty, we have a backup system. But the point is, we don't want to use the backup system. That's not what it's for. It's there for backup. What we want to do is always top off our carbohydrate fuel tank. So that means that whatever we use for the day is pretty much what our needs are. And this is another reason why people can't figure out what that number is, because it's going to vary from everyone. But very few people have an understanding of how this carbohydrate fuel tank goes up and down, up and down. But this is what I spent over 1,500 hours perfecting a procedure to do that, so that I knew exactly how much I needed to eat to make sure when I competed athletically, I always went in with a full fuel tank. I figured out mathematically what it took to make sure I filled up my carbohydrate fuel tank. And guess what I found out? When you eat a plant-based diet, every time you eat, you top off your carbohydrate fuel tank. So what happens when you don't eat? Well, eventually that fuel tank will empty. And if you're not eating at all, then the body knows that, and the body will switch over to ketosis, so your brain doesn't need glucose. It can work off of fat. But we still need carbohydrates, and what the body's going to do is go after our own lean body tissue. And that's the problem with the water fast. You're going to lose some muscle mass on a water fast. And if you're just eating a low-carb diet, the only way you're going to save your muscle mass is if you eat a whole bunch of extra protein, because up to 58% of dietary protein can be used for gluconeogenesis to create these new carbohydrates. So what most bodybuilders do, who think they need like 400 grams of protein or something insane, and they're not eating any carbs, is they're getting their carbs from all that excess dietary protein. But we know the excess dietary protein is not good. It's the worst thing we want to do in excess is a high protein diet, especially if it's from food we're not biologically adapted to eat, especially the animal products. So why don't we have an essential need? Where our experts can't figure it out, and it's kind of an iffy question. It's hard to understand. But when you eat the only food you're meant to eat, it's not even a concern. We don't have to think about it. Now, we have an essential need for amino acids, and we have an essential need for fat, meaning if we don't get those, we're in trouble because we can't create them. The carbohydrates we can create out of lean body tissue or excess dietary protein. We don't want to do either one of those, don't you see? You don't want to use excess dietary protein. You don't want to use your own body tissue. You don't want to kick in gluconeogenesis. So if there is an essential need for carbohydrates, it'd be whatever that magic number is for each individual to prevent gluconeogenesis. Well, that's too complicated. Well, let's make it simple. Quit eating the wrong food. Eat the only food that wants you to eat it. When you do, you're in for a treat.